Hi there, and welcome to Coup English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. John Maynard Keynes, the mind that rescued modern economics. Chapter 1. A Childhood in Cambridge. John Maynard Keynes was born on June 5, 1883, in Cambridge, England. His full name was John Maynard Keynes, but his family and close friends often called him Maynard. From the very beginning, his life was shaped by learning. He was born into a world of books, ideas, and thoughtful conversation. His father, John Neville Keynes, was an economist and a lecturer at the University of Cambridge. He taught logic and political economy, and he was a serious and organized man who believed in reason and balance. His mother, Florence Ada Keynes, was just as impressive. She was one of the first women to study at the university level and later became a leader in local politics, even serving as the mayor of Cambridge. She was energetic, caring, and deeply involved in social causes. In this intellectual and supportive household, young Maynard grew up with both freedom and direction. His parents encouraged curiosity. At the dinner table, conversations ranged from philosophy to history to economics. Books lined the shelves of every room. Learning was not something to be forced, it was something to enjoy. Maynard showed signs of brilliance at an early age. He began reading independently when he was just 3 years old. He asked questions constantly, and not just simple ones. He wanted to know why the sky was blue, how money worked, and what made people rich or poor. He was not only bright, but also thoughtful and serious beyond his years. His younger siblings, his brother Geoffrey and sister Margaret, often looked up to him. While many children played games outside, Maynard liked to stay indoors, reading or doing mental calculations for fun. However, he was not shy. He could be lively and even humorous, especially when explaining something to others. He enjoyed sharing what he knew and helping others understand the world. Even as a boy, Maynard showed a great interest in numbers and patterns. He loved solving problems and puzzles. He would often create his own arithmetic challenges and solve them without using pen or paper. His ability to think logically and clearly impressed everyone around him. At school, he was far ahead of his classmates. He attended Perse School in Cambridge, where his teachers quickly noticed his exceptional abilities. They gave him extra reading and more complex tasks, and he never failed to impress. Yet, he was not just a math genius. He also loved literature, philosophy, and history. His mind was wide, not narrow. He could think in numbers, but he could also feel deeply and express himself clearly in writing. His parents played a key role in his development. They never pushed him to become someone he was not. Instead, they gave him space and tools to discover who he was. His father often spent time discussing logical problems with him, while his mother taught him about public service and the value of helping others. Cambridge itself also helped shape young Keynes. The town was full of scholars, students, and visiting thinkers from all over the world. The air seemed to be filled with questions and discussions. It was a place where learning was a way of life. This environment gave Maynard not only knowledge, but also a strong sense of purpose. He began to believe that ideas could change the world, and that, perhaps, one day, he could be part of that change. When Maynard was 13 years old, he won a scholarship to Eton College, one of the most prestigious schools in England. This was an important step, not just because of the school's high level of education, but because of the social connections it offered. Eton was a school for the sons of powerful families, future politicians, diplomats, and leaders. Yet Maynard, the son of a university lecturer and a civic-minded mother, earned his place there through merit and intelligence. At Eton, his academic success continued. He stood out for his excellent memory, deep thinking, and ability to express difficult ideas in a clear way. He was especially strong in mathematics, but he also wrote essays that showed maturity far beyond his age. His teachers saw a future leader in him. Though Eton was a place of tradition and privilege, Maynard was never content to simply accept the old ways. He often challenged ideas, asked hard questions, and offered new viewpoints. He was respectful but bold, careful but creative. His curiosity, combined with a strong sense of personal confidence, helped him grow not only in knowledge but in character. By the time he finished at Eton, Maynard Keynes had already become someone remarkable. His childhood had been filled with ideas, encouragement, and discovery. He had developed a mind that was both sharp and compassionate, a rare combination. And yet, his journey had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Young Scholar. At Eton College, John Maynard Keynes quickly stood out. Surrounded by boys from some of Britain's most powerful families, he did not come from wealth or nobility. Yet, his intelligence and thoughtful manner earned him respect. He was tall and somewhat awkward in appearance, but when he spoke or wrote, people listened. He had a gift for making complex ideas seem simple and clear. Keynes was not the kind of student who followed rules just to please teachers. He was independent-minded. He questioned authority and disliked memorization without understanding. While many students accepted ideas because they were taught, Keynes wanted to know why something was true. This habit of questioning would stay with him for life. He continued to excel in mathematics, which he found both challenging and beautiful. Numbers were not just symbols for him, they were tools for understanding the world. At the same time, he also enjoyed history, literature, and philosophy. He believed that a well-educated person should not only think logically, but also understand human nature and society. This balance between logic and emotion would later become a key part of his economic thinking. Keynes loved ideas, but he also loved conversation. At Eton, he often spent hours talking with friends about politics, ethics, and art. He had a quick wit and a sharp tongue. His letters from this time reveal a confident, sometimes sarcastic, but deeply thoughtful young man. He enjoyed playing with words and ideas, often using humor to challenge the views of others. In 1902, after finishing at Eton, Keynes won a scholarship to King's College at the University of Cambridge. It was a proud moment for him and his family. At Cambridge, he would meet people who would change his life, and he would begin to change the world in return. Cambridge, in the early 20th century, was a center of learning and debate. It attracted some of the best minds in Britain and beyond. Here, Keynes studied mathematics, but he also explored philosophy and economics. He took courses in moral science and logic. He was not focused on one narrow path. He was building a mind that could think broadly and deeply. One of the most important people in Keynes's life at Cambridge was Alfred Marshall, the great economist who had helped turn economics into a serious academic subject. Marshall recognized Keynes's talent early on and encouraged him to study economics seriously. At first, Keynes was not very interested. He thought economics was dry and too focused on technical details. But Marshall told him something important. Economics is not just about money. It's about people. That idea stayed with Keynes. Keynes soon began to see economics as a way to understand human behavior. Why do people save? Why do they spend? What causes unemployment or inflation? These were not just questions about numbers. They were questions about life, society, and justice. Keynes wanted to explore these deeper meanings. During his time at Cambridge, Keynes joined a private discussion group known as the Apostles. This group met secretly and shared ideas about truth, beauty, and friendship. Many of its members later became part of the famous Bloomsbury Group, a circle of artists, writers, and thinkers who shaped modern British culture. Through these friendships, Keynes developed a strong belief in free thought, honesty, and personal integrity. He began to see that ideas were not only for books, they could shape the world. One of the things that made Keynes different from many students was his ability to connect theory with real life. He didn't just study ideas, he tested them. He thought about how theories could be applied to real economic and political problems. This practical side made him attractive to teachers and later to government leaders. After receiving excellent marks in mathematics, Keynes decided to take the civil service examination in 1906. This exam was used to select people for important jobs in the British government. It was very competitive, covering subjects from logic and history to economics and foreign languages. Keynes placed second overall in the exam, but his score in economics was the highest. Ironically, he had studied the least for that part. His talent in economic thinking came naturally. This success allowed him to join the India office in London, where he worked on financial and trade issues related to British colonies. Though the job was prestigious, Keynes found it uninteresting. He missed the intellectual energy of Cambridge and the freedom to explore ideas. After 2 years, he returned to King's College, this time as a lecturer and researcher in economics. It was there that he began to truly find his voice as a thinker. In lectures, he was not a typical professor. He spoke clearly, but often challenged his students. He asked questions that had no easy answers. He encouraged debate. His classes were popular not only for the content, but for the excitement they brought. Students left his lectures feeling energized, even puzzled, but always thoughtful. As he moved into his mid-20s, Keynes began writing serious academic papers. He explored subjects like the value of money, price systems, and government finance. He also began advising government departments. Even at a young age, people began to see him not just as a scholar, but as someone who could solve real-world problems. By the end of this early chapter in his life, Keynes had developed many of the traits that would define him: brilliant yet grounded, logical yet imaginative, playful yet serious. He had begun to see that the world was full of problems that could not be solved with old ways of thinking. He was not afraid of change. In fact, he welcomed it. The foundations were now in place. A remarkable career in economics and a life of public influence was about to begin. Chapter 3. The Cambridge Years. Ideas take shape. When John Maynard Keynes returned to Cambridge in 1908 as a young lecturer in economics, he was already thinking far beyond traditional academic lines. Although only in his mid-20s, he brought with him not just sharp intelligence, but also growing confidence. He had worked in government, seen how policies were made, and felt the limits of theory without practical understanding. Now, he was ready to build something new, not only in economics, but in how people thought about economics. At Cambridge, Keynes became a fellow at King's College, one of the most respected colleges in the university. As a fellow, he was free to teach, research, and write. But more than anything, he was given time to think, and he used it well. His lectures were often crowded, not because students had to attend, but because they wanted to. His ability to speak with both clarity and charm made him a favorite among those eager to understand the world in fresh ways. Keynes did not just present information, he challenged assumptions. He often began his lectures with a simple question: what do we think we know, and why? He pushed students to go beyond what textbooks said. He invited debate, encouraged disagreement, and treated ideas as living things meant to be tested, reshaped, or even thrown away. This approach deeply influenced his students, many of whom would later become leading thinkers and public servants. Outside the classroom, Keynes remained closely involved with the Apostles, the elite discussion group he had joined as an undergraduate. This group, which met secretly and placed a high value on honesty and friendship, helped him sharpen his thinking about ethics, society, and the role of the individual. Among its members were future stars of British literature and philosophy, including Bertrand Russell and Lytton Strachey. Together, they formed a small but influential circle, one that cared deeply about truth, beauty, and the power of reason. Many of these friends later became part of what came to be known as the Bloomsbury Group, a collection of artists, writers, and intellectuals who lived and worked in London's Bloomsbury area. The group rejected Victorian values and embraced freedom of thought, artistic expression, and personal honesty. Keynes was not only a member, but a central figure. He brought economic thinking into their conversations, while they helped him see the human side of money, work, and society. It was during these years that Keynes began writing one of his first major works, Indian Currency and Finance, 1913, based on his earlier experience working at the India office. This book examined the complex financial systems that linked the British Empire with its colonies. Though technical in parts, the book reflected his growing skill in connecting theory to real-world concerns. It also demonstrated his ability to write with both clarity and purpose, making economics not only understandable but meaningful. At the same time, Keynes was also beginning to shape a new identity, that of a public intellectual. He wrote articles for newspapers and journals, not just for economists, but for the educated public. He believed that economics mattered too much to be left only to specialists. He once said, "Ideas shape the course of history," and he meant it. For Keynes, the job of an economist was not to sit in an office, but to engage with the world. His early essays explored subjects such as free trade, the gold standard, and public spending. While his views were not always popular, they were always thought-provoking. He argued that markets were not always efficient, that governments had a role in stabilizing economies, and that uncertainty, not perfect knowledge, was often the true driver of human behavior. These ideas were still forming, but the seeds of his later revolutionary thinking were clearly present. Keynes's writing style was also unusual for an economist. He did not fill his papers with long equations or dry models. Instead, he wrote with elegance and wit. He used metaphors, stories, and even humor to make his points. He once described economics as a method rather than a doctrine, an apparatus of the mind. For him, the goal was not to memorize rules, but to train the mind to think clearly and practically. Another important part of Keynes's life during this time was his growing role in the affairs of King's College and the university as a whole. He took an active interest in how the college was run, helped make decisions about finances and admissions, and even advised on investments. He was not just a thinker, he was a doer. Privately, Keynes was also becoming more open about his personal life. Although homosexuality was still illegal in Britain, he formed several important relationships during these years, including with the writer Duncan Grant. These relationships were deeply meaningful to him, and they contributed to his belief in the importance of personal freedom and integrity. In his circles, he found acceptance, understanding, and inspiration. Throughout these early Cambridge years, one theme continued to grow in Keynes's mind: the idea that human behavior could not be explained by pure logic alone. Emotions, expectations, and uncertainty all played vital roles in how people made choices. He began to see that traditional economics, with its faith in perfect markets and rational actors, was missing something essential, something human. Keynes's Cambridge years were not just about preparing to be an economist. They were about preparing to be a revolutionary thinker. He was building a worldview, a way of seeing the economy not as a machine, but as a living system shaped by real people. And he was preparing himself for the moment when the world would need that new vision more than ever. That moment would come sooner than he expected. Chapter 4: War and Wealth. The Economist at the Front. When World War I broke out in 1914, John Maynard Keynes was not a soldier. He did not carry a weapon or wear a uniform, but he quickly became one of the most important minds in Britain's war effort. His battlefield was not in the trenches, but in the Treasury, where money, not bullets, decided the fate of nations. At the start of the war, Keynes returned to government service. He was appointed to a key position at the British Treasury, the institution responsible for managing the country's finances. Although still young, he was recognized for his intelligence, his knowledge of international finance, and his ability to see the big picture. War is expensive, and Britain needed brilliant minds to figure out how to pay for it. Keynes was given the task of managing financial relations with Britain's allies, especially the United States. As the war continued, Britain's need for loans and supplies from America grew rapidly. Keynes was at the center of delicate negotiations, arranging massive lines of credit, tracking exchange rates, and making sure that Britain could keep buying weapons and food. He worked long hours under immense pressure, but the experience also began to change him. The war was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Millions of lives lost, economies shattered, and empires trembling. Keynes, who had once enjoyed academic life and polite debate, now found himself surrounded by urgency, fear, and waste. He began to feel that something was deeply wrong, not just with the war, but with the system that had allowed it to happen. He started asking hard questions. Why had nations built up so many weapons? Why had economic rivalries become more dangerous than diplomatic ones? And most importantly, could economics offer any real help in making peace, not just in managing war? Even while serving in the Treasury, Keynes kept writing. He published articles in journals and newspapers, offering analysis of the war economy and suggestions for better policy. He argued that blind loyalty to outdated ideas, like the gold standard or balanced budgets, was dangerous. Governments, he said, had to be flexible and smart. In times of crisis, new thinking was not a luxury, it was a necessity. His boldness sometimes made him unpopular with older officials. He disliked following rules just because they were tradition. He wanted results, not rituals. Still, his talent could not be ignored. By 1917, he had become the Treasury's representative at the Supreme Economic Council and was deeply involved in the war's financial planning. As the war neared its end, Keynes was sent to one of the most important events in modern history, the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Here, world leaders gathered to decide the terms of peace after Germany's defeat. Keynes was part of the British delegation and served as the lead financial advisor. He observed firsthand the discussions between powerful men Georges Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Britain, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States. At first, Keynes had hope. He believed that a fair and reasonable peace treaty could rebuild Europe and avoid future conflict. But what he saw at Versailles shocked and saddened him. The French, seeking revenge for past losses, demanded heavy payments from Germany. The British were split, and the Americans, though idealistic, were often ineffective. Keynes believed the Treaty of Versailles was not just unfair, it was dangerous. It placed huge financial burdens on Germany, demanding reparations far beyond what the country could pay. He argued that punishing a defeated nation too harshly would create bitterness, poverty, and political instability. He feared that such a treaty would not bring peace, but only sow the seeds of another war. Unable to persuade the other leaders to change course, Keynes resigned from his position in protest. It was a bold and painful decision, but one that reflected his integrity. He refused to be part of what he believed was a serious mistake. Soon after returning to England, he poured his anger and concern into a book. The result was The Economic Consequences of the Peace, published later in 1919. It became an international sensation. Keynes did not hold back. He described the peace talks as a mixture of greed, confusion, and short-sightedness. He warned that the economic terms of the treaty would ruin Germany's economy, harm Europe's recovery, and possibly lead to another conflict. The book shocked many and made Keynes famous beyond the world of economics. It sold thousands of copies and was translated into multiple languages. Politicians, scholars, and citizens debated its message. Some praised him for his honesty and foresight. Others accused him of being unpatriotic or naive, but few could ignore him. For the first time, Keynes was not just a thinker, he was a public figure. Privately, the war had taken a toll on him. He had watched as millions died, and as nations made choices based on pride instead of reason. The experience deepened his belief that economics had to serve people, not just numbers. It also convinced him that the world needed a new kind of economic thinking, one that could respond to crises, protect jobs, and promote peace. In the years that followed, Keynes would return to Cambridge, but he was no longer just a lecturer. He had become a man whose ideas reached across borders, whose warnings had been heard by kings and presidents. He had entered the world stage, and he was only getting started. Chapter 5. The Roaring Twenties and the Fragile Peace. After the devastation of World War I, Europe struggled to find its balance. Cities lay in ruins, economies were broken, and millions of lives had been lost. Yet, strangely, the 1920s would also become known as a decade of energy, innovation, and reckless optimism, the Roaring Twenties. For John Maynard Keynes, these years were a time of both public influence and private searching. He was no longer simply an academic economist. He had become a powerful voice in shaping public debate. His book, The the economic consequences of the peace had made him famous around the world. Invitations poured in for him to lecture, advise, and comment on economic affairs. But Keynes remained restless. He knew that the peace created at Versailles was fragile. Beneath the excitement of the post-war boom, he saw danger signs, deep economic imbalances, unresolved political tensions, and societies trying to forget their pain rather than heal it. He worried that unless new ideas were developed, another crisis could easily unfold. Back at Cambridge, Keynes resumed teaching, but he also expanded his activities. He became involved in journalism, writing regular articles for newspapers and journals. He did not want economics to be a private conversation among experts. He believed that ordinary citizens deserved to understand the forces shaping their lives. His writing style was clear, bold, and often witty, making complex ideas accessible to many. Keynes also became an investor. Seeing opportunities in the shifting post-war economy, he put his own money and sometimes his friends' money into stocks, currencies, and commodities. His record was mixed at first. He suffered heavy losses during the early 1920s. But true to his nature, he learned from experience. Over time, he developed a style of investment based on careful research and a willingness to change direction when circumstances changed. Eventually, he built a significant personal fortune, unusual for an academic of his era. Meanwhile, the broader economy was changing in unpredictable ways. In the United States, a massive boom was underway. New industries, automobiles, electricity, radio, transformed everyday life. Stock markets soared, and consumer confidence reached new heights. Europe, by contrast, faced a more uneven recovery. Britain struggled with high unemployment and slow growth. Germany faced hyperinflation, with prices rising so fast that paper money became almost worthless overnight. Keynes watched these developments with a mixture of fascination and concern. He believed that the global economy was becoming dangerously interconnected. If one major economy collapsed, it could pull others down with it. He also recognized that governments were not well prepared to manage such risks. Many leaders still clung to old economic doctrines, a deep faith in balanced budgets, free markets without interference, and the return to the gold standard. Keynes challenged these ideas. He argued that governments could not simply stand by during economic crises. Instead, they needed to be active, stimulating demand when private spending fell, investing in public works, and using monetary and fiscal policies to guide the economy toward stability and growth. One of his major targets was Britain's return to the gold standard in 1925. The gold standard was a system where a country's currency was tied to a fixed amount of gold, aiming to provide stability in exchange rates. Many believed it was a symbol of financial strength, but Keynes thought it was a dangerous mistake, especially at the pre-war exchange rate, which made British exports too expensive and deepened unemployment. In a series of articles and public speeches, Keynes criticized the government's decision. He famously called the policy a tragic blunder. He explained that clinging to the gold standard forced Britain into a rigid, painful deflation, making it harder for workers to find jobs and for businesses to grow. His arguments, though not immediately accepted by political leaders, found a growing audience among economists and the general public. While fighting these public battles, Keynes was also finding new happiness in his private life. In 1925, he married Lydia Lopakova, a Russian ballerina who had been a star in the ballet's Russes. Their marriage surprised many of his friends who had never expected him to settle down, but Lydia brought lightness and joy into Keynes's life. She was lively, affectionate, and strong-willed, providing a warm counterbalance to his intense, often abstract mind. Their relationship was not without challenges. Keynes's Bloomsbury friends initially found Lydia difficult to accept, but over time, they grew to respect her. Lydia supported Keynes's work while insisting he also take care of his health and enjoy life beyond economics. Together, they traveled, hosted lively gatherings, and built a partnership based on deep affection. As the decade moved toward its close, Keynes's reputation continued to rise. He was seen as an independent thinker, willing to speak truth to power. Yet he also recognized how fragile the world economy remained. In private, he feared that the prosperity of the 1920s rested on shaky foundations, easy credit, speculative bubbles, and a dangerous overconfidence that the horrors of war could never return. He warned that an economic collapse was possible, and that if it came, the consequences could be even more severe than after World War I. Few listened carefully at the time. Optimism was easier than caution. The future seemed bright, but Keynes's sharp mind and deep understanding of economic forces told him otherwise. Beneath the glitter of the Roaring Twenties, he sensed a gathering storm. Soon, events would prove him right. Chapter 6: The Great Depression and the Revolutionary Mind. In October 1929, the world changed overnight. The American stock market crashed, sending shockwaves through the global economy. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment soared. The roaring energy of the 1920s collapsed into silence and fear. John Maynard Keynes, always alert to global economic patterns, was not surprised. He had long warned that the prosperity of the post-war years was unbalanced and unsustainable. But even he could not have predicted the full scale of the catastrophe that followed. The Great Depression quickly became the worst economic crisis in modern history. By the early 1930s, unemployment in the United States reached 25%. In Germany, poverty fed political extremism. In Britain, even educated workers lined up for bread. Families lost homes, savings, and hope. Most governments responded with confusion or denial. They still believed in old economic rules. Balance your budget, reduce debt, and let markets correct themselves. These ideas had worked more or less in the past. But now, they failed completely. As governments cut spending to save their economies, demand fell even further. The result was a downward spiral of job losses and shrinking incomes. Keynes knew this approach was not only outdated, it was dangerous. He saw clearly that the depression was not caused by laziness, greed, or lack of production. It was caused by a lack of demand. People were too frightened to spend. Businesses, seeing no customers, stopped investing. The entire system froze. In this frozen economy, Keynes argued, only one force was big enough to restart activity: the government. He began to write with new urgency, using both his sharp intellect and his powerful language skills to explain a new way of thinking. His message was radical, especially for the time. Governments must spend more, not less, during a crisis. This was a shocking idea to many. Traditionally, people thought that governments should act like careful households, saving money, avoiding debt. Keynes flipped this idea upside down. In a national economy, he explained, if everyone saves and no one spends, the economy will sink. When private demand fails, public demand must rise. That means government investment in jobs, infrastructure, housing, and services. His argument was not just theoretical, it was built on observation and logic, and it came with a promise. If done wisely, government action could reduce unemployment and shorten the depression. In 1931, as Britain faced another deep crisis and left the gold standard, Keynes published essays in Persuasion, a collection of powerful articles addressing economic challenges. His voice became louder, reaching politicians, business leaders, and the public. While many still resisted his ideas, the failures of traditional methods made them harder to defend. Keynes also worked with growing energy at Cambridge. He taught, advised, and mentored a new generation of economists. Some of them would later become famous in their own right. But even in the classroom, Keynes was never limited to academic arguments. He believed ideas should change the world, and that the world, in turn, should shape our ideas. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, President Franklin D. Roosevelt began his New Deal in the United States. Though Roosevelt did not fully adopt Keynes's theories at first, his large-scale public works and employment programs reflected some of the same principles. Keynes watched with interest and sent private letters to American officials, offering suggestions. He believed the New Deal was a step in the right direction, even if it did not go far enough. At the same time, the rise of fascism in Europe deeply troubled Keynes. He saw that economic despair had helped extremist ideologies take root. In Germany, Hitler promised jobs and pride to a wounded nation. In Italy, Mussolini claimed he could restore order through authoritarian power. Keynes knew that bad economics could lead to bad politics. He believed that a stable and fair economy was the best defense against tyranny. In 1936, after years of thinking, testing, and revising, Keynes published his most important work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. This book would change the way economists and governments viewed the world. In the general theory, Keynes broke away from classical economics completely. He argued that full employment was not natural or automatic. Economies could settle into long periods of high unemployment unless someone, usually the government, acted to push them back toward growth. His focus on total demand or aggregate demand became the cornerstone of what would later be called Keynesian economics. The book was not easy to read. It was complex and filled with new concepts, but its impact was massive. Younger economists quickly embraced it. Policymakers began to listen. The old belief in self-correcting markets faded, replaced by a new understanding that governments had both the power and the responsibility to act. Still, acceptance was far from universal. Many economists rejected Keynes's ideas, calling them dangerous or unrealistic. Others feared that encouraging government spending would lead to inflation or moral weakness. But Keynes.com and Determined continued to explain and refine his theories. He welcomed debate. He was not afraid of opposition. In fact, he enjoyed it so long as it was intelligent. Privately, this was also a time of quiet strength. His marriage to Lydia remained strong, though his health was not. Years of hard work, stress, and travel had taken a toll on his body. He began to suffer from heart problems and was often forced to rest. But even as he slowed down physically, his mind remained sharp and his spirit unbroken. By the late 1930s, with the world still struggling to recover and war once again on the horizon, Keynes stood at the center of a revolution in thought. His vision was not just about economics. It was about creating a society where people could live with dignity, where government served the people, and where knowledge could guide action. The Great Depression had tested his ideas, and his ideas had answered the call. The next great test would come soon, not in the form of a market crash, but in the fires of war. And Keynes, though often underestimated by politicians, would again play a key role in shaping the future. Chapter 7. War Finance and the Architect of Peace. By the time World War II broke out in 1939, John Maynard Keynes was no longer a young rebel economist. He was a respected thinker, a seasoned public figure, and the most influential economic voice in Britain. Though his health was fragile, his mind remained powerful. He knew that war, terrible and tragic, would also be an economic battle, and this time he intended to shape the outcome. When Britain declared war on Germany, the country was unprepared, not only militarily, but financially. War would require vast resources, factories, workers, food, steel, oil. But how could the government afford it all without causing inflation or destroying the fragile recovery from the Depression? Keynes had a clear answer. In 1940, he published a short but powerful pamphlet titled How to Pay for the War. It offered a detailed plan for financing the war without hurting the economy. His key message was this: to avoid dangerous inflation, the government must control demand, not by cutting spending, but by managing when and how people spend their money. He proposed a system of deferred pay. Instead of high taxes or borrowing a loan, workers would pay part of their earnings into special government accounts. This money would be saved and returned to them after the war. It was, in essence, a forced saving program. During wartime, when goods were scarce, people couldn't spend much anyway. But once peace returned, those savings would be released, helping to rebuild the economy. The idea was bold, and many in government at first resisted it. But the logic was strong, and as the war progressed, Keynes's voice was heard more clearly. His influence at the Treasury grew. He was consulted on nearly every major financial decision, from rationing policies to long-term planning. Behind his economic advice was a broader vision. Keynes believed the war must not only be won on the battlefield, but also used as an opportunity to create a better society. He feared that, without careful planning, peace would bring back the suffering of the 1930s, unemployment, poverty, and political instability. He called for a new kind of economic order, one where the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Even as bombs fell on London and British cities faced nightly air raids, Keynes worked tirelessly at his desk in the Treasury. He drafted policies, debated ministers, and argued in favor of public investment and full employment, even during wartime. He saw beyond the war to the kind of peace that could follow. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States had entered the war in 1941. Keynes recognized that America's strength, economic and military, would soon shape the global future. So in 1942, despite his poor health, he sailed to Washington. The trip was long and risky, but he was determined. His mission was to negotiate a large American loan to support the British war effort. The American officials admired Keynes's intellect, though they didn't always agree with his proposals. He was persistent, often forceful, and never shy about challenging ideas he thought were wrong. He could be charming or blunt, depending on what the moment required. His goal was not personal gain, it was survival for Britain and a vision for the post-war world. Back in Britain, he continued to inspire younger economists, many of whom were now working in the civil service. His ideas were no longer radical theory, they were guiding national policy. As the war approached its final years, attention turned to what would come next. The world had seen two devastating wars in just over 2 decades. Millions had died, economies had collapsed, political systems had failed. If the world returned to the economic chaos of the 1920s and 1930s, another war might follow. This was a terrifying possibility. Keynes believed the solution lay in international cooperation. Nations must not isolate themselves. They must work together, share responsibilities, and build institutions that could prevent another global economic crisis. So in 1944, he was sent as the head of the British delegation to a conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. There, representatives from 44 allied nations met to design a new international financial system. The goal was to ensure stable exchange rates, rebuild war-torn economies, and support global trade. Keynes had dreamed of such a system for years. He brought with him a bold plan: the creation of an international clearing union that would manage trade imbalances between countries using a new global currency, which he called the Bank. He argued that both creditor and debtor nations should adjust their behavior so the burden of economic imbalance would not fall entirely on the weak. However, the Americans, led by economist Harry Dexter White, had different ideas. The US was now the world's dominant economic power, and they wanted a system based on the US dollar. Though Keynes fought hard for his vision, the final plan reflected more of the American proposal. Still, Keynes played a crucial role in shaping the two institutions that emerged: the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank. These organizations, born out of the Bretton Woods Conference, would go on to shape global economics for decades. Despite his disappointment over the details, Keynes considered the conference a great achievement. He had helped create a system where nations could work together to solve problems, avoid destructive currency wars, and promote recovery. But the work took a heavy toll. Keynes was exhausted, his heart condition had worsened, and his energy faded. Yet he continued writing, advising, and thinking. He had come a long way from the sharp Cambridge student in love with ideas to the man who helped shape the post-war world. War had brought destruction, but also change. Keynes had used his brilliance not just to explain the world, but to improve it. In the next chapter, we will witness the final years of his life, his enduring legacy, and how the world came to adopt, challenge, and revisit the ideas of the man who dared to say, the ideas of economists are more powerful than is commonly understood. Chapter 8: Twilight Years and Final Impact. By the end of World War II, John Maynard Keynes was physically weakened but intellectually unshaken. He had poured his last reserves of strength into shaping not only Britain's wartime economy, but also the international financial structure that would guide the world into peace. Though his health had declined sharply, Keynes continued to serve, advise, and inspire until the very end. In early 1945, as the war neared its conclusion, Keynes returned to Britain from the United States. He had successfully secured an American loan to help stabilize the British economy, a difficult and tense negotiation that required his full diplomatic skill. It was a victory, but it came at a high personal cost. The transatlantic travel, the intense meetings, and the endless debates had taken a toll on his already fragile heart. Yet Keynes did not retire. Instead, he accepted an appointment to the House of Lords as Baron Keynes of Tilton. There, he continued to speak on economic issues, defending the agreements made at Bretton Woods and the need for global cooperation in the post-war world. His speeches were fewer now, but still sharp and influential. At home, Keynes spent more time at Tilton, his country house in Sussex, with his beloved wife, Lydia Lapokova. Their marriage, though unexpected by many of his friends in earlier years, had been strong and affectionate. Lydia, once a famous Russian ballerina, now devoted herself to caring for her husband. Their quiet life at Tilton was filled with simple pleasures: music, reading, short walks in the garden when Keynes had the strength. He remained in contact with many of his former students and colleagues, especially at Cambridge. Some came to visit him, seeking advice, or simply to sit and talk with the man who had once led a revolution in economic thought. He read widely and wrote letters, offering insights on post-war planning, British industry, and the need to maintain full employment. Despite his growing weakness, Keynes was still driven by his sense of duty. He knew that peace was fragile and that rebuilding the world required more than weapons and treaties. It required bold, cooperative economics. He continued to urge governments not to repeat the mistakes of the past: austerity, neglect of the unemployed, and failure to invest in the future. He worried especially about Britain's economic condition. The war had left the country deeply in debt, and austerity measures were being discussed again. Keynes pushed back. He insisted that cutting spending in the name of balancing the budget was dangerous. Growth and stability, not frugality alone, would rebuild a better society. But his heart could no longer keep up with his mind. In April 1946, just months after the war had ended, Keynes suffered a series of heart attacks. On Easter Sunday, April 21st, he died at Tilton at the age of 62. His death was met with widespread mourning in Britain and across the world. Newspapers carried his obituary on the front pages. Economists, politicians, and ordinary citizens paid tribute to the man whose ideas had changed how governments understood their role in society. Prime Minister Clement Attlee praised Keynes's genius and service. In the United States, leading economists recognized his influence on the new international order. But more than headlines, Keynes left behind a legacy of thought that would shape generations to come. In the years that followed, Keynesian economics became the dominant approach in Western democracies. His central idea that governments could and should intervene in the economy to maintain full employment was put into practice. Public investment, social welfare programs, and counter-cyclical spending were no longer seen as radical, but responsible. During the 1950s and 1960s, many countries experienced unprecedented economic growth while following Keynesian principles. The post-war boom, often called the golden age of capitalism, was in large part inspired by his vision. At the same time, Keynes's legacy was not without critics. Some economists later argued that his ideas encouraged too much government spending or created long-term debt problems. In the 1970s, new economic challenges, such as stagflation, led to the rise of alternative theories. Yet even his critics admitted that Keynes had permanently altered the field. More importantly, Keynes had changed the way people thought about the role of economics itself. He had not been a narrow theorist, lost in numbers. He had been a thinker, a dreamer, and a doer. For him, economics was not just about markets or money, It was about people, society, and the future. He once wrote, "The ideas of economists and political philosophers are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else." His life proved this statement to be true. In education, too, Keynes's impact remained. His books and papers continued to be studied by students around the world. His boldness inspired new generations of economists to think beyond formulas and to address the real problems of unemployment, inequality, and economic security. In Britain, his contributions helped shape the post-war welfare state. The National Health Service, public housing programs, and increased access to education all reflected the belief that governments should use their power to support the well-being of their citizens. At Cambridge, the institution that had nurtured him as a student and thinker, Keynes remained a legend. The economics department he had helped transform carried forward his spirit of critical inquiry and public engagement. Keynes had once asked, "What makes a good society?" His answer was not simple wealth or power, but the ability to give people security, opportunity, and hope. This humanistic vision was perhaps his greatest legacy. He had lived through 2 world wars, a global depression, and dramatic social change. Through it all, he never stopped believing in the possibility of improvement. His courage came not from certainty, but from commitment, the belief that with reason, compassion, and imagination, societies could choose a better path. In the next chapter, we will explore how Keynes's ideas continued to evolve after his death, how they were embraced, rejected, and revived across the decades, and why, decades later, his voice still echoes in times of crisis. Chapter 9. Legacy in Motion: The Rise, Fall, and Return of Keynesian Thought. John Maynard Keynes's death in 1946 did not mark the end of his influence. Rather, it began a new phase in the life of his ideas. For decades, Keynesian economics would not only dominate academic circles, but also shape the policy of governments across the Western world. Yet his legacy would also face serious challenges: critiques from opposing schools of thought, changing political climates, and shifting global dynamics. Still, whenever economic crisis struck, policymakers often found themselves returning to Keynes. In the immediate post-war years, Keynesian ideas formed the backbone of economic policy in the United Kingdom, the United States, and many European countries. Policymakers accepted the principle that governments could play an active role in managing the economy. Keynes had shown that full employment was not a natural outcome of free markets, but something that required strategic intervention. His message was clear: during a downturn, governments should increase spending even at the cost of borrowing to stimulate demand. In times of growth, they could balance the budget and pay down debts. This counter-cyclical approach became standard practice. In Britain, the post-war Labour government adopted policies inspired by Keynes's vision, such as the creation of the National Health Service, expanded public housing, and a commitment to full employment. In the US, the New Deal and later programs under Presidents Truman and Johnson showed clear Keynesian influence. Even conservative governments often retained core aspects of Keynesian policy, acknowledging that market forces alone were not enough to ensure prosperity for all. Economists during the 1950s and 1960s spoke confidently of having solved the problem of depressions. This period, sometimes called the Golden Age of capitalism, was marked by high growth rates, low unemployment, and rising living standards. Many credited Keynes for laying the intellectual foundation of this success. But the 1970s brought unexpected trouble. A new phenomenon, stagflation, shook economic thinking. This strange mix of high inflation and high unemployment seemed to contradict Keynesian logic. According to the theory, inflation typically came with strong growth, not with stagnation. Critics, especially from the monetarist school led by economist Milton Friedman, argued that Keynesianism had gone too far. They claimed that too much government spending and interference had created inefficiencies, inflation, and large public debts. They pushed for free markets, less regulation, and reduced government roles in the economy. the political winds began to shift. In the late 1970s and 1980s, leaders such as Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US embraced free market ideologies. Keynesian policies were cut back, taxes were lowered, state services reduced, and central banks took center stage in managing inflation. For a time, Keynes seemed out of fashion. His name was often used as a symbol of outdated ideas, too slow, too statist, too optimistic about government. Textbooks began to focus more on market-driven models. In universities, classical and neoliberal theories regained ground. Yet even as governments moved away from Keynesian policies, the core concerns that had driven Keynes' unemployment, inequality, instability never disappeared. Then came the global financial crisis of 2008. Banks collapsed, millions lost jobs, housing markets fell, entire economies seemed to freeze. Suddenly, the free market approach looked fragile. Calls for government action grew urgent, and once again, the world turned to Keynes. Across the globe, leaders used Keynesian-style stimulus plans. The US under President Barack Obama passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, injecting hundreds of billions of dollars into the economy through infrastructure projects, tax cuts, and support for state budgets. In Britain, similar emergency spending took place. China launched its own massive stimulus program. Keynesianism was not just back, it was essential. In a 2009 article, Time magazine featured Keynes on its cover, calling him the man who saved capitalism again. Economists and journalists revisited his writings, noting how relevant his ideas remained, especially his understanding of uncertainty, psychology, and the role of governments in crises. Even conservatives who had long opposed government spending admitted that the situation required intervention. It was a moment of intellectual humility, and Keynes, once dismissed as a figure of the past, was once again at the center of the global conversation. Of course, not all agreed on how to interpret Keynes. Some used only parts of his theory, focusing on short-term spending while ignoring his calls for long-term responsibility. Others argued that Keynesian policies were necessary during a crisis but should not become permanent. Still, the 2008 crisis had proven something important. Keynes had not been defeated by history. Instead, his ideas had simply been waiting for the right moment, for new leaders and for new challenges. Today, Keynes's influence can be seen not just in how governments respond to recessions, but in broader discussions about inequality, climate change, and the role of the public sector. Many modern economists who focus on social investment, green transitions, and job creation owe a debt to his thinking. In classrooms, Keynes is studied not only as a figure of history, but as a guide for present and future challenges. His boldness, his willingness to question orthodoxy, and his belief in human progress continue to inspire. More than anything, Keynes reminds us that economics is not a fixed science. It is a tool for building a better world. It must change with time, adapt to new problems, and remain grounded in human realities. As we look back, it is clear that Keynes did not merely give us a set of formulas, he gave us a way of thinking. His words still echo. The difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas as in escaping from old ones. It is a challenge that every generation must face anew. In the final chapter, we will reflect on Keynes the man, his character, philosophy, and the enduring questions he raised about what kind of society we want to create. Chapter 10. The Philosopher, Economist, A Mind Beyond Numbers. John Maynard Keynes is remembered as one of the most influential economists in history, but to reduce his identity to that of an economist alone would be a mistake. He was, at heart, a philosopher, a moral thinker, a lover of the arts, and a man driven by a deep concern for the future of humanity. Keynes believed that economics was not an end in itself. It was a tool, a means to build a better, fairer society. In his view, the purpose of economic thought was to improve the quality of life, to reduce suffering, and to allow people to pursue happiness, creativity, and freedom. He once wrote that the avoidance of unemployment is not merely a question of technical efficiency, but a matter of social justice. This human-centered view of economics set him apart from many of his peers. Where others saw equations, Keynes saw people. He cared deeply about the consequences of economic policies, their impact on ordinary lives, families, and futures. His vision was shaped by more than data. It was formed through philosophy, literature, and relationships. As a young man, Keynes had studied under philosophers like G.E. Moore, who taught that the most important things in life were beauty, truth, and friendship. Keynes carried this with him throughout his life, blending economic theory with ethical concern. He also believed that ideas mattered, that good ideas could change the world. He famously said, "The ideas of economists and political philosophers are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else." This belief in the power of thought gave Keynes both confidence and responsibility. He was unafraid to challenge orthodoxy. Whether criticizing the Treaty of Versailles or questioning free market dogmas, he was willing to stand against the tide. But he also knew that theory without action was not enough. He worked tirelessly to influence public policy, to advise leaders, and to create real change. At the same time, Keynes was deeply practical. He understood that perfect solutions rarely existed, and that compromise was often necessary. His proposals were not utopian dreams, but balanced responses to complex realities. He believed in gradual progress, in trial and error, and in policymaking based on evidence rather than ideology. Outside of economics, Keynes led a rich and varied life. He was a passionate supporter of the arts. He helped to establish the Arts Council of Great Britain and was instrumental in funding cultural institutions. He believed that a healthy society should support artists, writers, and performers, not just bankers and industrialists. His personal life was also unconventional. Keynes was open-minded and emotionally expressive, a trait not common among his peers. He had romantic relationships with men and later married the Russian ballerina Lydia Lopukova, whom he adored. Their relationship surprised many in his intellectual circle. But for Keynes, love and beauty were as important as reason and logic. He also had a sharp wit and a playful personality. Despite his serious public image, he enjoyed writing humorous letters, attending lively debates, and collecting rare books. Friends often described him as both brilliant and charming, a man with a quick mind and a warm heart. Keynes's life and work were guided by one central belief: the future can be better than the past if we choose to make it so. He did not accept that poverty, war, and unemployment were unavoidable. He rejected the idea that society must simply endure economic suffering in the name of market forces. Instead, he believed in human agency, the power of individuals and governments to shape outcomes through reason and courage. In the years since his death, many have debated his theories. Economists have revised, challenged, or adapted his models. Politicians have alternated between embracing and rejecting his policies, but few have questioned his larger vision, a society in which economics serves people, not the other way around. In a world still facing inequality, climate change, global conflict, and economic instability, Keynes's ideas continue to offer guidance. His belief in cooperation over conflict, in planning over chaos, and in shared prosperity over individual gain remains relevant, as nations search for balance between markets and society. Between growth and sustainability, Keynes's voice still speaks. He reminds us that the economy is not a machine. It is a human creation, shaped by values, choices, and shared goals. If guided wisely, it can uplift rather than divide, heal rather than harm. In the final months of his life, Keynes remained active in public service. He worked tirelessly on international economic policy, particularly on plans for the post-war order. Though suffering from heart trouble, he continued to attend meetings and write letters. When he died in April 1946 at the age of 62, it was said that he had given everything he had to his country and to the world. He left behind no children, but in another sense, his legacy is everywhere. every time a government acts to protect jobs during a crisis, every time economists debate how to balance budgets with human needs, and every time a student learns that economics is not just about money, but about life. Keynes once imagined a world in which people would work less, enjoy more leisure, and live with dignity. He did not believe that material gain was the highest human aim. Instead, he hoped for a future where human beings, freed from fear and want, could turn to the pursuit of what truly matters, to live wisely and agreeably and well. That future is still a dream, but thanks to Keynes, it remains a dream we can understand, and perhaps someday realize. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.